The United States of the Fallout universe has always been a chaotic place. From the social unrest and global conflict of the pre-war world, to the monsters, raiders, contamination, and privation of the world the bombs created, everything has always been in a state of upheaval. All of those events, though, are practically placid when compared to the immediate aftermath of the bombs. Those that lived through those early days of the New World would never forget the horrors they experienced. I'm the Resolute Cartographer, and this is the story of the Tournquist family. Just outside Malden, Massachusetts lies a small housing development known as the West Everett Estates. While still under construction, there were a few families living in the completed units, including the Tournquist family, the Ames family, and Ron Cobb. The Tournquist family had moved into the West Everett Estates to be closer to Wayne Tournquist's job at MedTech Research, the Malden location for the biomedical company MedTech. While Wayne worked as a researcher, his wife Bonnie commuted downtown where she worked as a nurse at Mass Bay Medical Center. Their sons, Michael and David, 12 and 6 years old respectively, attended school in Malden. Because of the ages of Michael and David, the family was eligible for Vault-Tech's subsidized enrollment fees that would grant them access to Vault 75. While most families would have been thrilled to qualify for such a benefit, the Tournquists didn't trust that Vault-Tech's vaults would be the safe haven they were advertised to be. They didn't want to be unprepared for the possible apocalypse though, and thus they built a small bunker under their shed to serve as the family shelter. Along with a bunker, the family formed an emergency action plan for the day of the bombs. Unfortunately, this would come in handy on the morning of Saturday, October 23rd, 2077. That day started normal as ever, with Bonnie Tournquist rising early in the day and heading off to work at the hospital. Wayne Tournquist got up an hour or two later with the sound of the resumed construction nearby. He got his sons ready to go to the daycare that Malden Elementary School hosted on the weekends, and they drove into town. Once he dropped the boys off at school, he headed to work. He'd been working for only a short time when an alert came across his screen. Bombs were falling across the country. The war with China had turned nuclear. This alert, the result of Mr. Tournquist having hacked his director's terminal, gave him just enough time to get out of the building before a lockdown kicked in. Outside, Malden was in chaos as people reacted to the screaming civil defense sirens. The roads were too clogged, so Mr. Tournquist made his way on foot. As many were rushing to get out of town, most of the town's families with school-aged children rushed to Malden Elementary School seeking entry to Vault 75. In the tumult, Wayne Tournquist hurried to the school and found his sons. As part of the emergency response plan the Tournquists had created, 12-year-old Michael had taken 6-year-old David and gotten him away from the teachers that would have ushered them into the vault door. Together, the Tournquist men rushed home in time to hear planes going by overhead. They ducked into their shelter and closed the door. Over the coming days, Wayne, Michael, and David sat and waited. After the shaking from the bombs had subsided, they turned on the radio, listening when they could as the signal cut in and out. They hoped that Bonnie would come home from the hospital, but the sound of gunfire cracking above made that seem unlikely. Wayne tried to call Bonnie at the hospital on the radio, but the airwaves were overwhelmed with interference from the fallout and the cries of thousands looking for help. Though all he wanted to do was head into the city to find his wife, he knew he couldn't leave his kids alone in the bunker. Little did Wayne know that though he didn't hear back from Bonnie, his signal had gotten through. Things were not going well at Mass Bay Medical Center. The military seized the hospital, guarding it and those within. There hadn't been enough shelters in the city to hold anywhere near the population of Boston, and thus there were thousands with radiation burns and poisoning. Along with the sick and the injured from radiation, there were those that had suffered at the hands of looters searching for medication, ammo, and other supplies. With the national logistical system obliterated, there was no food coming into the city to feed the thousands of survivors. Outside the protective military cordon, there was fighting in the streets. Not between the United States and the Chinese, but between the hungry, desperate citizens of Boston. When the hospital ran out of medical supplies, all they could do was work to make people comfortable, as the world outside the hospital was overwhelmed in the rising tide of violence. When Wayne Tournquist had called the hospital, Bonnie hadn't heard it herself, but another nurse had left a note of the message. The military defenses of the hospital were beginning to buckle as the soldiers realized there was no resupply or reinforcement incoming. With the situation deteriorating to the point where she could no longer do any good at the hospital, Bonnie decided to attempt the trip home. Unfortunately, the message she left at the hospital for Wayne, should he come looking for her, is the last trace of her. Back at the Tournquist bunker, Wayne and his boys sat underground together for over 3 months, waiting out the worst of the fallout. On January 27, 2078, they finally emerged from their bunker. After tunneling through the wall to tap into the water line coming off the local water tower, they found themselves short of supplies. Wayne decided to do some scavenging, and he headed across the street to Ron Cobb's place. Ron had taken part in the community's construction, and thus Wayne thought he might have some supplies at his house. This first attempt at post-apocalyptic scavenging went poorly, and Wayne soon found himself with a gun to the back of his head. As Wayne turned to face the wielder, he saw that it was the homeowner, Ron, and to his horror, Ron had been stewing in radiation for the previous months. Though Wayne didn't yet have a word for what he was seeing, Ron Cobb had become a ghoul. As Ron pressed the gun barrel into Wayne's mouth, a gunshot rended the air. To Wayne's surprise and relief, he saw that Lance Ames, another one of his neighbors, had survived and had saved him, firing on Ron from rooftop. Wayne thanked Lance for saving him and agreed to meet the following night to talk. Months before, as Wayne Tournquist had been sealing the bunker entrance, Lance Ames, his brother Leon, and their families had been traveling home from New York. They were going down a freeway in Connecticut when the bomb started detonating. The EMP stalled the cars and left the Ames family without transportation. Abandoning their cars on that highway, they worked their way back to Boston on foot, reaching the West Everett estates after 2 full weeks of walking. Along the way home, they saw much of the worst of the post-war world. Lance and Leon discussed how to properly protect their families as they walked, eventually deciding to wall up the neighborhood. The night after Lance saved Wayne, the families met and planned their defense of the neighborhood. They began to wall up the gaps between the houses, but to close the big gaps they would need something larger. To that end, Wayne, Lance, and Leon traveled to the Irish Pride shipyard to steal their trucks. Thanks to Leon's criminal past, he was able to hotwire the semis, and they traveled back to the West Everett estates together. While Lance and Leon managed to park their trucks, Wayne flipped his, though luckily it fell into place where it needed to be. With the walls in place, the adults could cut back on their watch duty, and Michael, David, and the Ames children could safely leave their shelters to play in the sun. On April 3rd, 2078, the Tournquist family celebrated Bonnie's 30th birthday in absentia. While they didn't know her fate, they wanted to celebrate her and enjoyed a cake the boys had made for her. Unfortunately, this little glimmer of hope would soon be snuffed out. A few days earlier, March 27th, 2078, Lance and Leon had been out scouting. When they heard a large group passing by, they hid themselves in a structure to wait for them to pass. Leon recognized one of them and eagerly revealed himself, telling his old buddy from the mob that they were set up in a nearby walled fortress. Though the dozen armed men let them leave, it wasn't long before they arrived at the walls of the West Everett estates. They demanded that the families leave and surrender the community to them. When Wayne and Lance refused, they left temporarily, returning with more men. A fight broke out, and though they managed to scare the raiders off for the moment, Lance was hit and killed in the shooting. Wayne sent the boys into the bunker to get what they could carry so that they could flee the compound. David attempted to leave a message for his mother should she make her way home, but Michael and Wayne were soon grabbing him to get out. The raiders returned and seized the compound as Leon wet himself and subsequently joined them. Though we don't know what happened to Wayne, Michael, and David, we can always hope that they successfully fled, taking Lance's wife and children with them. If we get really optimistic, we can hope that they even met Bonnie somewhere out there in the wasteland. As for Leon, the raiders plan to use him as cannon fodder on their next raid into the ruins of Boston. By 2287, the remains of the West Everett estates serve as a super mutant base. Alright, that's all I found on the Tournquist family, but I've got several things I wanted to note before closing things out. First, I want to note that the West Everett estates have the same architectural style as the Sanctuary Hills neighborhood just outside of Concord. Beyond this, I want to note that the architectural style greatly resembles that of the prefabricated houses manufactured by the Lustron Corporation from 1947 to 1950. This is a Google Maps screenshot of a few surviving examples of these houses in Albany, New York. Second, based on the information we have here, I conclude that Bonnie Tournquist was pregnant at 16, gave birth to her son Michael in the fall of her senior year of high school at the latest. Despite this, both she and Wayne graduated from college while raising a child. Third, it appears they decided to fill the gap between the wall of the house and the truck with a radioactive barrel. It should be noted that this barrel sits just outside the Tournquist boys' bedroom. In fact, your Geiger counter will tick in their room because of this. I hope that they were still sleeping underground. Fourth, I don't know specifically why Michael and David were at school on the day of the bombs. In his first log entry from October 26, 2077, Wayne says, quote, "Michael managed to get David away from the teachers, and they ran and hid," unquote. While I see why this would be necessary to keep his kids safe from the vault, I don't understand why they were in the presence of their teachers at that time. The bombs dropped on a Saturday morning. Why were they at school? I considered that maybe they were at some sort of school event or daycare sort of situation as both of the parents were working, and that's what I put into the narrative, but that information isn't given anywhere. Fifth, this story tells me that MedTech was connected to the Enclave. I say this because Wayne Tournquist's director received advance notice of the bombs. Advance notice that the bombs were incoming seems to have been a perk specific to Enclave members. Thanks to their pre-war government contracts, it's easy to see how they could have become entangled with the shadowy pre-war version of the organization. Sixth, it's interesting to consider that the roots of the Raiders of the Commonwealth may be tied into pre-war organized crime. At least one of these raiders had been part of the mob, and it's possible that the rest of the group had been as well. Seventh, by avoiding Vault 75 on the day of the bombs, Wayne lengthened his own life by at least 5 months and avoided his children becoming test subjects in a heinous experiment. So good on him for not trusting Vault Tech. If you're interested in more on that experiment, I'll link my video on Vault 75 here. Eighth, there are fortifications on top of collapsed houses in the community that I don't believe were destroyed on the day of the bombs. I'm fairly certain that these houses collapsed over time as their structures eroded away with weathering. I don't think that these were rubble at the time of the Tournquist and Ames family. From this, I think that we can take it that over the 200 plus years since the bombs, there have been multiple communities that have lived within the walls of the fort that were created by the original occupants, and that they've repeatedly reinforced these walls. Ninth, there's a discrepancy in the dates given for certain events taking place. According to Wayne Tournquist, he left the bunker for the first time on January 27, 2078. According to Lance Ames, Wayne helped him and Leon finish the walls around the West Everett Estates on December 12, 2077, over a month prior. I think that these were just an error on Bethesda's part, as I can't imagine why either person would lie and personal logs meant for their own consumption. 10th, there's no record of nuclear winter in this account. In Appalachia, there are multiple logs that talk about how awful the winter of 2077 to 2078 was. In the logs from the West Everett Estates, there's no record of that. It could simply be an effect of the local climate in both cases, Appalachia being in the mountains and the Commonwealth being on the coast. I'll be sure to keep an eye out for future logs regarding nuclear winter. Lastly, this is one of the best sources we have on life in the immediate aftermath of the bombs in Boston. It sounds like absolute chaos, in which the remnants of the military were doing the best they could to maintain order, despite facing an unwinnable war against the slide into the Dark Age. I see from this that things remained chaotic for longer than I thought, as I had believed that most people outside on the day of the bombs, within a certain range of the craters, would have been killed or ghoulified within days, but the Ames family trekked across country through the worst of it. Aside from this chaos, we see from the stories of the Tournquist and Ames families, people doing the best they could to keep their families safe in the increasingly dangerous world, and doing a fairly good job of it until Leon screwed it up. Of course, with the world going the way it was, it feels as though they were likely doomed, with it being a question of not if, but when they would have been run off their land or killed. It's easy to hate Leon, especially when he joined the people that killed his brother, but I don't think that their settlement was long for the world regardless of Leon's unthinking actions. That should do it for the story of the Tournquist family. If you want to receive notifications when I launch these lore videos, you can follow me on Twitter at GamingWithMaps. If you appreciate what I do here and want to support the channel financially, you can become a patron with Patreon. I want to thank my patrons, Mesothelioma, 76 of Texas, Jill AWS, Brian, and Dark Malcontent of Metaverse Studios for their support. This has been the Irresolute Cartographer. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again next time.